Threll Van had watched 340 species come apart on the intake floor, and he had never once seen a species arrive already smiling. The 4 creatures in Lot 219 were smiling. They stood in a row inside the transparent holding cell, blinking under lights tuned to a spectrum their eyes weren't built for. Wrists bound and restraints calibrated for a species with roughly twice their bone density, and they were smiling at each other like they just won something. Threll checked his data slate twice, certain the behavioral scanner had glitched. It hadn't. Baseline stress readings, elevated. Baseline despair readings, nearly flat. That combination did not exist in the compact's 3 centuries of acquisitions. He made a note in the margin, the kind of note a careful processor made when something didn't fit the model, and then he did what every careful processor did with notes like that. He filed it and moved on to the auction floor, because the buyers were already filtering in and Threll Van did not get paid to have hunches. The Cathan Compact did not call itself a slaving operation, and technically it wasn't one. Slavers caught things and sold them raw. The Compact bought the raw product from slavers at a markup, ran it through 6 to 9 weeks of behavioral correction, and sold the finished product, compliant, biddable, permanently and measurably calmer, at a markup so large it had built 4 moons' worth of processing facilities and a reputation that made even predator species nervous. The pitch, printed on every wall of the auction concourse in 11 languages, was simple. Anything can be broken, if you understand what it's afraid of losing. 340 species had proven the pitch correct. The Varen hive minds broke fastest, sever the link to the central node, and the drones simply stopped, waiting for orders that would never come, and you could walk them onto a transport ship like furniture. The Dascani broke second fastest, pack animals, all of them, and once you demonstrated total control over the pack's alpha, the rest fell in line within days. Even the notoriously vicious Carinth war clans broke, eventually, once their processors worked out that a Carintha's real fear wasn't pain, it was dishonor, and dishonor could be manufactured on a schedule. Every species had a hinge. Find the hinge, apply pressure, and the door came off. Lot 219 for bipedal omnivores, designation Homo sapiens, purchased as an incidental job lot from a bankrupt slaving crew who'd apparently gone bankrupt trying to catch more than 4 of them, did not, on paper, look like it would be difficult. They had no hive mind. They had no visible pack alpha. They weren't even armed with anything more dangerous than opposable thumbs and a species-wide reputation, mostly rumor, for being unreasonably hard to kill and unreasonably easy to underestimate. The auction floor sold them as a curiosity lot. A processing conglomerate called Vantis Correctional bought all 4 for less than the price of one healthy Dascani, on the theory that whatever they were, 4 of them would be an easy set to break together, and an interesting one to advertise once broken. The acquisitions director who approved the purchase, a methodical creature named Bassin Wren who had never lost money betting against a species' will, later admitted in an internal memo, one Threll would only read after everything had already gone wrong, that the deciding factor hadn't been confidence. It had been curiosity. Nobody at Vantis had ever successfully processed more than 1 human, because no slaving crew had ever successfully captured more than 1 at a time without the operation ending badly for the crew, and Bassin Wren had wanted, quite simply, to be the first to find out why. He would get his answer. It would not be the one he was hoping for. Threll Van, 6 years into a processing career he had never once questioned before that morning, was assigned as their intake handler. He learned their names before he learned anything else about them, which was itself unusual. Most lots didn't get names on the intake sheet, they got numbers, and the numbers stayed until correction was complete, at which point a name was assigned by the buyer, something easy to pronounce and easier to command. But these 4 had given their names to the slaving crew apparently unprompted on the theory, one of them explained to Threll later, when explaining things to Threll had become a habit, that if you're going to be sold, you might as well make the people selling you say your name while they do it. Mara Okafor, youngest of the 4, quickest to speak, the one whose stress readings dipped every time she made one of the others laugh. Devin Cruz, broadest, quietest, the one who did the actual physical labor of checking every seam of the holding cell for weakness, methodically, for the first 6 hours without once looking like he expected to find anything, because, Threll realized later, the checking wasn't about finding an exit. It was about not sitting still while afraid. Priya Anand, the one who talked to the guards. Not to negotiate, not to plead, she asked them questions. About their shift length. About whether the lighting bothered their eyes too. About what they had for breakfast. The guards found it deeply unsettling, mostly because none of them knew what to do with a captive who seemed more curious about them than afraid of them. Sam Kessler, the oldest, the quietest talker but the most active thinker, the one who spent the first day doing something the intake scanner flagged as an anomaly and Threll's supervisor dismissed as a stress behavior. Composing music silently, tapping out rhythms against his own knee, mouth moving without sound. For individuals, no hierarchy Threll could detect. No hive link, no pack structure, no chain of command for the facility to sever. Just 4 people who had apparently decided, sometime before they ever reached the auction floor, that they were a team and had never bothered to write down the rules of the team anywhere an outside observer could read them. That was the first thing that should have worried Vantis Correctional. Didn't. Standard correction began the way it always began. Isolation. Dascani, isolated from the pack, spiraled into catatonic anxiety within a day. Varen, isolated from the hive link, essentially ceased to function as individuals. The isolation was, for them, close to death. Isolation worked because nearly every social species the compact had ever processed measured its own existence through connection to something larger, and removing that connection removed the self along with it. Threll separated the 4 humans into individual cells on day 3 per protocol, and watched the feeds with the clinical detachment his training had built into him over 6 years. Mara sang to herself. Not well, Threll's species couldn't judge human music with any real accuracy, but continuously, for hours, switching between what she'd later explain were about 11 different songs, badly remembered, filled in with hummed guesses where she'd forgotten the words. When she ran out of songs, she started making up new ones about the cell, about the lighting, about a guard's haircut. The stress readings on Threll's slate ticked up, as expected. But they never crossed the threshold that isolation protocol was built to reach. She wasn't isolated. She had brought all the people she knew inside her head with her, and she talked to them. Devon did calisthenics until his cell's environmental sensors flagged unusual heat output, then meditated, then did calisthenics again, on a rotation so steady that Threll's supervisor initially logged it as a malfunctioning behavioral loop before realizing it was deliberate. Devon wasn't fighting the isolation. He was outlasting it on a schedule like a man serving a sentence he'd already decided he would survive. Priya talked to the wall. Specifically to the small maintenance drone that came through twice a day to check the cell's air scrubbers. A machine with no cognition whatsoever, and she talked to it anyway, narrating her day to it, asking it questions it couldn't answer, thanking it when it left. Threll's supervisor called this a coping delusion. Threll, watching the feed longer than his shift required, thought it looked less like delusion and more like practice, like a woman keeping her voice in the habit of reaching outward, so that when there was finally someone real to reach toward, the reflex would still work. Sam did nothing visible at all for the first 2 days, which alarmed the monitoring staff more than any of the others' behavior, until the tapping started again, quieter this time, aimed at the cell wall instead of his own knee, in a pattern that repeated every few minutes. Took Threll 4 days to realize it wasn't random. It took him 2 more to realize it was Morse code, a communication system his linguistics database had on file as obsolete, Earth origin, low priority. And that Sam was tapping the same short sequence over and over into a wall he had no reason to believe anyone was listening to. Stillhere. He wasn't sending it to Threll. He was sending it to the wall between his cell and Devon's, and Devon, Threll checked, appalled at himself for checking, appalled more at what he found, was tapping it back. Isolation protocol assumed a species needed an external connection to survive psychologically, and that severing the connection would break them. It had never accounted for a species that could apparently manufacture the connection from nothing, out of memory and rhythm and stubbornness, faster than the facility could take it away. By day 9, isolation phase was declared a failure. All 4 subjects' composite despair metrics remained. In the words of the report, Threll was asked to file and did not want to file, anomalously and consistently low. Phase 2 was the despair induction protocol, the compact signature process, the one that had worked on every single species that had ever passed through a compact facility, including several the marketing department privately admitted they'd been surprised by. The theory was elegant in its cruelty. You didn't need to hurt a captive to break them. You needed to teach them, systematically, that nothing they did mattered. Give them small tasks with achievable rewards, then quietly rig the tasks to fail regardless of performance. Let them believe for a while that effort was connected to outcome, and then sever that belief again and again until the subject stopped trying, because trying and not trying produced the exact same result, and a mind that can't tell the difference between action and inaction eventually stops choosing either. It had worked on Karanth warriors who'd have died before showing physical fear. It had worked on Daskani who'd bite through restraints rather than submit to a threat. It worked because it didn't attack the body. It attacked the connection between hope and effort, and every intelligent species the Compact had ever processed ran on that connection somewhere underneath everything else. They ran it on the 4 humans starting day 10. A simple puzzle: reroute a small maze of glowing panels to reach a reward chamber holding food they were mildly, not severely, deprived of. Solvable. Rigged, after the first success, to reset itself no matter what the subject did. Mara solved it in 4 minutes the first time, ate her reward, and grinned at the camera she'd already located and identified as a camera 3 days earlier. The second time, the maze reset itself the instant she reached the reward chamber. She stood there for a moment, said something to the empty room that the facility's translation software rendered, imperfectly, as "oh, that's how it's gonna be," and then sat down cross-legged in front of the panel and started deliberately failing the puzzle on purpose, taking the wrong turns, humming while she did it, visibly amused. Threll stared at the feed for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. The protocol depended on the subject believing, at some level, that the outcome mattered. That's what made the rigged failure devastating. Mara had simply concluded, correctly, within 1 reset, that the game was fixed, and instead of despairing over a fixed game, she'd decided the fixed game wasn't worth the dignity of trying. She'd opted out. The facility had no protocol for a subject that opted out cheerfully. Devon solved the puzzle, found it rigged, and then spent the next 6 sessions systematically testing the maze's failure conditions instead of trying to win it. Timing the reset, mapping which paths triggered it and which didn't, treating the whole rigged system as a smaller, solvable puzzle nested inside the fake one. He wasn't despairing. He was debugging. Priya asked the observation drone, out loud, whether it thought the maze was fair, and when it didn't answer, told it, gently like she felt bad for it, that it wasn't her fault the game was broken, and that she hoped whoever designed it wasn't too disappointed. Sam didn't engage with the maze at all after the second reset. He sat with his back against the wall and, for the first time since intake, hummed audibly, the tapping rhythms Threll now recognized, becoming something closer to an actual melody, and Threll realized with a cold, professional unease that Sam wasn't spiraling into apathy the way the protocol predicted. He was composing. The rigged failure hadn't taught him that effort was meaningless. It had apparently just bored him, and he'd found something more interesting to do with the time. Despair Induction Protocol's central mechanism was the collapse of belief that effort connects to outcome. None of the 4 had ever held that belief as tightly as the protocol assumed. Somewhere in whatever made humans human, effort and outcome were already understood to be loosely, unreliably, sometimes comically connected, and the 4 of them treated a rigged game less like an existential wound and more like a mildly interesting design flaw in an otherwise unimpressive escape room. By day 19, Vantis Correctional's regional office sent Threll's facility director a message that used the word unprecedented twice in 1 paragraph, which in Threll's 6 years of employment he had never seen happen. It was around this time that the junior guard assigned to the night rotation, a Daskani named Vecht who had transferred from a hive-adjacent facility specifically because he found the correction work there unbearably grim, started spending his breaks in the observation gallery instead of the staff lounge. He told himself he was monitoring the anomaly for professional reasons. In practice, he had simply started to enjoy watching them, in the guilty, half-embarrassed way a person enjoys something they haven't yet worked out whether they're allowed to. Vecht had processed intake for 11 species in his career, and every one of them, without exception, had gone quiet eventually, not silent in the literal sense but quiet in the deeper sense, the sense that mattered, the sense the Compact's despair metrics were built to measure. A quietness that meant a mind had stopped reaching outward because reaching outward had stopped seeming worth the cost. He had learned to recognize that quietness so well he sometimes thought he could smell it coming, days before the metrics caught up. Lot 219 never went quiet. If anything, as the days passed, they got louder, not in volume but in range, in the sheer number of things they found worth doing with the hours the facility gave them. Mara taught Priya the words to one of her half-remembered songs, and Priya, tone-deaf by any species standard, sang it anyway, badly, proudly, until Devon threatened with real affection to file a formal noise complaint against both of them. Sam built, out of nothing but folded ration wrappers and idle hands. Something he called a paper crane and gave it to a guard who had no idea what to do with a small foil bird except keep it, which she did on a shelf in her own quarters, for reasons she couldn't fully explain to herself either. Vec started leaving the observation gallery each night with a feeling he eventually admitted to himself was envy, and it was Vec, not Threll, though the two men never compared notes and never knew how close their private doubts ran to each other, who first suggested quietly in a report nobody above him took seriously that Lot 219's correction wasn't failing because the protocol was flawed. It was failing because the subjects had built something between themselves that the protocol had never been designed to compete with, and no amount of pressure applied to any one of them was going to be stronger than whatever that was. His report was filed, logged, and ignored. The compact did not run on the observations of junior guards. It ran on the assumption that the model had always worked before and would work again if given enough time. It was not given enough time. Phase 3 was where the facility's real leverage was supposed to live, threat transference. If a subject wouldn't break for their own sake, you demonstrated consequences to someone else in the lot. It was the cruelest tool the compact had, reserved for stubborn cases, and it was the only phase in Threll's entire career he had watched actually succeed against every species that reached it, because whatever else broke down, the drive to protect something you cared about tended to survive intact, and that made it exploitable. Threaten the pack alpha, and the pack folded. Threaten the hive node, and the drones folded. Threaten someone a subject loved, and the subject folded, because unlike hope in your own effort, love didn't get smarter or more cynical under pressure. It just got more afraid. Threll argued against running Phase 3. Not out loud, not in any way that would appear in a record, but he spent an evening he wasn't proud of afterward, sitting in the observation gallery long after his shift ended, watching the four of them eat a meal together in the shared recreation cell they'd finally been allowed into, watching Mara steal food off Devon's tray and Devon let her, watching Priya braid something out of a torn strip of blanket while she talked, watching Sam finally hum out loud where the others could hear and Mara start singing actual words over it badly and all four of them laughing at how badly, and Threll thought, with a clarity that frightened him more than any behavioral anomaly on his slate, I don't want to see what happens when they threaten each other. He ran it anyway. It was his job. They staged it during a routine cell transfer. Devon, restrained and separated from the others, exposed to what the humans were led to believe was a live threat of harm. A threat that was, per protocol, never intended to be carried out, only witnessed. The compact didn't need to actually hurt a subject. It needed the other subjects to believe it would, and to watch powerless while it happened. For 11 seconds, the protocol worked exactly as designed. Mara's, Priya's, and Sam's stress readings spiked harder and faster than at any point since intake. Real fear, sharp and total, the first genuine despair-adjacent signature the facility had recorded from any of them. Then, in the 12th second, something the protocol had never seen before happened. The three of them stopped looking afraid and started looking coordinated. Threll watched it happen across 3 separate feeds at once, and understood later that he was watching 4 strangers turn teammates do in real time something his species didn't have a word for, because his species had never needed one. A shift from individual fear to collective tactics, instantaneous, unspoken, without any signal Threll's monitoring equipment could detect passing between them. Priya began talking, fast and calm, directly to the guard holding the restraint controls, asking questions that weren't really questions. How much was he being paid? Whether he'd checked the maintenance logs on that restraint rig lately, whether he knew what his supervisor's actual authorization threshold was for lethal contact with purchased assets. Questions built, Threll realized with slow horror, to make a nervous, underpaid guard doubt the chain of command he was standing inside of. Mara started making noise, loud, rhythmic, deliberately disorienting. Time to draw every camera and every guard's attention toward her instead of the restraint rig. And Sam, quiet, still composing Sam, simply began walking calmly toward the section of the cell wall he had spent 19 days tapping messages through, and pressed his palm flat against a maintenance seam Devon had identified and mapped back on day 1. A seam that led, Threll would later confirm from the schematics, to an access corridor no prisoner had ever been meant to locate. The threat was never carried out. It didn't need to be. Devon was released, unharmed, per protocol at the 11-second mark, but by then the facility had learned something no earlier phase had told it. Threatening one of them didn't isolate the threat to a hinge point the others would fold around. It activated all 3 remaining humans simultaneously, each running a different piece of a response that fit together without any of them stopping to plan it, because Threll understood this now, too late to be useful to anyone but himself. They had never needed a leader to coordinate around. They had spent 19 days building the coordination itself, quietly, out of songs and tapped code and questions asked to a maintenance drone, until protecting each other wasn't a hinge that could be threatened. It was just what they did, distributed evenly across all four of them, with no single point anyone could apply pressure to and expect the whole structure to fold. Phase 3's report, which Threll was required to file within 6 hours, contained a line his supervisor made him rewrite twice because the first two versions were, in the supervisor's words, editorializing. The line, in its final approved form, read, *subjects demonstrated coordinated defensive response inconsistent with individual threat vulnerability models. Recommend reclassification. What Threll actually wanted to write was simpler and truer, and would never appear in a compact document. You cannot threaten your way through 4 people who have already decided to survive as one thing. By day 26, the facility director stopped pretending the correction was proceeding on schedule and convened what the internal messaging called a disposition review, the polite compact term for deciding whether an unbreakable asset should be quietly destroyed as a contamination risk before it cost the company more in wasted processing cycles than it would ever earn back on the auction floor. Threll was not senior enough to be in that meeting. He found out about it because Priya asked him. That was the strange part, the part Threll turned over for the rest of his life whenever he tried to explain how a 6-year processing career ended in 11 days. Somewhere in the last 4 weeks, without either of them planning it, Threll Van had stopped being purely an intake handler running feeds from behind glass and started being someone the humans in Lot 219 talked to. It began small, Priya asking him the way she asked everyone about his shift length, whether the lighting bothered him too. Threll answered once out of reflex and then found he'd answered again the next day and the day after that, and that somewhere around day 15 he had started looking forward to it in a way that had nothing to do with data collection. He never told his supervisor. He told himself for a while that the extra conversation was simply good intelligence gathering, that understanding a subject's psychology from the inside made him a more effective processor, and he almost believed it until Priya asked him a question on day 26 that made the belief impossible to hold on to any longer. "Do you actually think what you're doing to us is working?" she asked, through the intercom, looking directly at the camera the way she always did when she wanted him specifically, not just any observer, to hear her. Not, is it working on paper? Is it working? Are we different than we were on day 1? Threll didn't answer because the honest answer was no, and the honest answer wasn't the kind of thing he was authorized to say into a recorded channel. "You know they're going to kill us if it doesn't work soon," she said, not as a plea, just as a fact laid on the table between them. "That's what disposition review means, isn't it? We looked it up in the handbook your guards left in the break room. You people write a lot of things down." He still didn't answer. She didn't ask him to. "I'm not asking you to save us," she said. "I'm asking whether you've ever met a species you actually thought deserved this, or whether you've spent 6 years telling yourself it works because it's easier than asking whether it should." Threll went home that night, a converted maintenance module 2 corridors from the processing wing that the compact generously called employee housing, and did not sleep, and somewhere around the 4th hour of not sleeping he understood that Priya's question had not been a manipulation tactic aimed at a guard she was trying to turn. It had been an actual question, asked by someone who genuinely wanted to know, and the fact that he couldn't answer it after 6 years told him more about himself than about her. The disposition review concluded with a compromise typical of a company more interested in salvaging an asset than admitting a failure. Lot 219 would be transferred to a specialized long-term facility for extended correction protocols, a euphemism Threll's slate defined when he finally looked it up properly instead of skimming past it the way he had 100 other pieces of compact jargon, as indefinite confinement under progressively harsher isolation, for as long as it took, with no upper limit on duration and no requirement that the subjects survive the process intact. Transfer was scheduled for day 31. Threll had 5 days. He told himself at first that he was simply going to talk to them more, gather better data, build a report thorough enough that leadership might reconsider the transfer order on efficiency grounds alone. He told himself this while he was already, without quite admitting it to himself, memorizing the guard rotation on the transfer corridor. He told himself this while he was already pulling up the facility's comms relay schematics on a terminal he wasn't authorized to access after hours, ostensibly to check bandwidth logs, actually to find out whether the relay's outbound frequency range could reach far enough to touch a civilian trade channel. Could. Barely. If someone routed a signal through 3 separate relay hops and didn't mind the transmission taking 11 hours to arrive anywhere useful. He didn't decide to help them in one moment he could point to afterward. It built the way the human's own coordination had built, in small unplanned pieces that only looked like a plan once you stood back far enough to see the whole shape of it. He mentioned once, during a routine check, that the transfer corridor's maintenance seam ran behind the recreation cell. He mentioned it the way you'd mention weather offhand to no one in particular, while Devon happened to be standing close enough to hear. He left a terminal logged in 11 minutes longer than protocol allowed, once, and didn't report the lapse. He filed Priya's Day 26 question in his personal notes instead of the official incident log, where a supervisor might have flagged it as evidence the subjects were attempting psychological manipulation of staff, which, Threll thought, turning the pages over in his head at 3 in the morning, might even have been technically true, and he found he no longer cared whether it was. By day 29 he had done nothing that would look, individually, like sabotage. Collectively, it amounted to exactly the resources 4 extraordinarily resourceful people needed to get themselves through a maintenance corridor, past a guard rotation Threll had described in more detail than any single innocent comment justified, to a service airlock connected to a supply shuttle scheduled for routine departure on day 30. 1 day before the transfer that would have buried them somewhere the compact's own paperwork admitted had no requirement they come out alive. Threll told himself, right up until the moment it happened, that he was simply gathering intelligence. He stopped telling himself that at 0340 on day 30, standing in an unlit maintenance corridor he had no legitimate reason to be in, watching for humans move past him in total silence with a coordination that no longer surprised him at all, and Mara, who had sung to an empty cell for 19 days rather than let it stay quiet, stopped just long enough to look at him and say, very softly, in the halting compact standard she'd picked up faster than any subject he'd ever processed. Thank you for being one of the ones who talked back. She didn't wait for a response. There wasn't time, and Threll found, to his own surprise, that he didn't need to give one. He'd already answered, in every small unreported thing he'd done for 5 days running. The maintenance corridor Threll had described so carelessly, so many times, that its layout might as well have been printed on a briefing sheet, ran for 200 meters behind a wall the facility's official schematics listed as solid. Devon had known it wasn't solid since day 1, back when checking every seam of a holding cell had looked, to any outside observer, like nothing more than a frightened man keeping his hands busy. It had never been about finding an exit that day. But he had found one anyway, and remembered exactly where it was, the way a person remembers the location of a fire escape in a building they never expected to need it in, right up until the night they did. They moved through the dark in a formation none of them had ever practiced and all of them somehow already knew. Devon first because he'd mapped it. Sam second, quiet, listening for the guard rotation's footsteps the way he'd once listened for a rhythm to finish a song. Priya third, ready to talk her way through anything that couldn't be avoided by silence alone. Mara last, watching the corridor behind them, because someone always had to watch what was behind, and she had decided, without anyone assigning it to her, that the job was hers. Twice, a guard's footsteps came close enough that all 4 of them stopped breathing at once, pressed into a maintenance alcove barely wide enough for 2, and Priya's hand found Mara's in the dark, not out of fear exactly, but because some things were easier to survive with a hand to hold, and neither of them had ever seen a reason to pretend otherwise. The footsteps passed. They kept moving. The service airlock, when they reached it, was exactly where Threll's careless comments had placed it, cycling on a schedule that gave them a 4-minute window before the next automated check. They made it with 90 seconds to spare, and Devon, quiet, steady Devon, who had spent 30 days testing rigged systems without once losing his composure, sat down hard on the shuttle's cargo deck the instant the airlock sealed behind them and put his head in his hands and shook, silently, for almost a full minute, while Mara sat beside him and didn't say anything at all, because some fears only needed a witness, not a solution. The shuttle's departure log, filed the next morning by a dock worker who had no idea what he'd loaded, recorded 4 unscheduled stowaways discovered mid-flight by the shuttle's automated cargo scan. Too late for the shuttle to turn back without burning fuel reserves it didn't have, and carrying, as it happened, a working long-range comms array the humans had located, dismantled, and partially rebuilt into something capable of reaching further than its manufacturer had ever intended. Sometime. between day 30 and the shuttle's scheduled arrival at a mid-lane tradeway station 6 days later. What they sent, once the array was working, was not a distress call. Threll learned this only afterward, from the same regional bulletins that eventually cost him his job, his housing, and very nearly his freedom, and he read the transcript more times than he ever admitted to anyone. It was a full, calm, methodically detailed account of the Cathan Compact's correction protocols, the despair induction methodology, the disposition review process and its euphemisms, and the exact facility coordinates, sent not to a human authority, which was 6 jumps and an uncertain reception away, but to the tradeway station's resident compact liaison office itself, along with a polite, plainly worded request that someone explain, on the record, why an operation running this description of business should continue to hold a trade license anywhere in compact space. It was, Threll thought later, the single most human thing any of the 4 had done in 30 days of captivity. Instead of running, instead of hiding, instead of even calling for rescue, they had simply written the whole thing down and handed it to the people who were supposed to be enforcing the rules, and dared the compact to explain itself in public. The compact could not. Not cleanly, not with 340 species worth of prior correction records sitting in the same archive the humans had thoughtfully cited by case number. The liaison office, more concerned with its own trade license than with Vantis Correctional's regional quarterly numbers, opened an inquiry within the day. A human trade envoy, dispatched, Threll gathered from the bulletins, not in outrage but in the flat, procedural tone of a species that had apparently been quietly expecting something like this to happen eventually, arrived at the way station 9 days later to collect 4 citizens and file paperwork that used the word unlicensed detention in every paragraph. Threll Van was dismissed from the compact's employ 11 days after the shuttle's departure log was filed, on grounds the termination notice described, with a bureaucratic delicacy that almost made him laugh, as conduct inconsistent with asset security protocols. He was not prosecuted. Nobody at Vantis Correctional wanted a public hearing that would require explaining under oath exactly what asset security protocols had been designed to protect against or why. He kept one thing from his 6 years of employment: the personal notes he'd never filed, including the log of a conversation on day 26 that he read again, months later, sitting in a rented room on a station he'd never planned to end up on, doing work that had nothing to do with correction facilities and never would again. Do you actually think what you're doing to us is working? He still didn't have a clean answer. But he had, for the first time in 6 years, stopped needing one to be comfortable. The regional bulletin that finally reached the general compact public, heavily edited, carefully worded to minimize liability, and still unable to fully disguise what had happened, never used the word broken once, which Threll noted with some satisfaction was itself an admission. 340 species had passed through compact correction facilities and come out the other side reclassified, relabeled, resold. The bulletin's final line, buried in a footnote about updated acquisition guidelines for exotic bipedal lots, was the only part of the whole affair that Threll thought anyone would remember in a decade. Asterisk species designation Homo sapiens is not recommended for standard correction processing. Acquisition of more than one individual at a time is strongly discouraged. Acquisition of any individual is, pending further review, discouraged generally. Asterisk. Somewhere on a human world Threll Van would never visit, in an account of the incident that would circulate for years afterward under a title far less careful than the Compact's bulletin, Mara Okafor would tell the story a different way, to a room of people who laughed at the parts the Compact had found unbearable. That the Cathan Compact had broken every species it had ever tried, 340 for 340, an unbroken record stretching back further than any of them, could verify right up until the week it bought for humans, and made, without ever quite realizing it until it was far too late to matter, the very last mistake of that particular kind it would ever get to make. 2 years later, the human trade envoy who had collected them from the way station, a patient, unhurried woman named Odalise Reyes, who had spent most of her career quietly cataloging the ways other species underestimated her own, sat across a different table from Threll Van, in a station bar 3 jumps from anywhere the Compact still operated, and asked him the question he had been half expecting since the day his termination notice arrived. Why help them? You'd worked there 6 years. You believed in the model or you wouldn't have lasted that long. Threll thought about it longer than the question probably needed. I don't think I believed in it, he said eventually. I think I'd just never been asked directly by something I was doing it to whether I believed in it. It's easier to run a process than to answer for it. Reyes turned her glass slowly on the table, unreadable in the way Threll had come to understand was a specifically human kind of patience, the sort that didn't need to fill silence just because silence was available. "For what it's worth," she said, "you're not the first processor who's reached out to us since the bulletin went public. You won't be the last either. Turns out asking someone to answer for what they've built is a hard question to unhear, once you've heard it out loud." Threll didn't ask how many. He suspected the number mattered less than the fact that it existed at all, that somewhere in 3 centuries and 340 species worth of quiet, efficient breaking, one lot had finally been loud enough, stubborn enough, and simply together enough that the whole machine had to explain itself in public and had found, when it tried, that there was no explanation that survived daylight. He asked instead about Mara and Devon and Priya and Sam, where they'd ended up, whether the ordeal had cost them anything they hadn't gotten back. Reyes smiled, the first unguarded thing she'd done all evening. "Mara does public speaking now. Talks to school groups about the whole thing, mostly to make sure nobody grows up thinking safety comes from finding one strong leader to hide behind. Devon runs a search and rescue training program, if you can believe that. Says 30 days of testing a rigged maze gave him more patience for search problems than a decade of prior work ever did. Priya works for the trade office that opened the inquiry, cross-examining exactly the kind of paperwork you used to file." Sam finished the song. "The song," Threll repeated. "The one he was tapping out on day 1. Took him 2 years, but he finished it. Named it after the cell number." Reyes finished her drink and stood, leaving Threll with the sense, not for the first time since that night in the maintenance corridor, that he had been on the losing side of something without ever quite being its enemy. "You did one decent thing in a very long career built on the opposite," she said, not unkindly, on her way out. "Most people don't get the chance to notice the moment it happens. You did. That's worth something even from us. Especially from us." He never saw her again. He kept the paper crane, though, the one Sam had made for a guard he'd never even met, which had somehow found its way, weeks later, mailed with no return address, into Threll's own small collection of things worth keeping from 6 years he mostly wanted to forget. It sat on a shelf in whatever room he was renting, for the rest of a much longer, much quieter life spent very far away from any correction facility. A small folded reminder that the hardest thing to break in 341 attempts had never really been a species at all. It had been 4 people who had simply decided, long before anyone tried to take it from them, never to let each other stand alone.